Good morning. For those of you that don't know me, and for those of you that do, I'm still Adrian Jones, and in addition to my role as Head of Operations for EPW, I've been the Acting Director for just over a year now. So I get the pleasure of leading this session where we're looking at the origins of EPW, what we do at the moment, and some thoughts on the future, which Stefan will be presenting to you. And at the end, we'll have a time for an opportunity for some prayer, to give thanks for everything that's happened over the last 20 years or so, and looking forward. So, but before I start speaking, we're going to sing another hymn. So if you'd like to stand, we're going to sing Christ Triumphant, Ever Reigning. Yes, Father, we thank you that you are a God who is triumphant, forever reigning over us, reigning, as we've heard, over the whole of the cosmos. So this morning we praise and we thank you for your love for us and for your eternal power and glory. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So, as I say, in this session, we're going to look at a little bit of the history of EPW and where we came from. Now, I feel a little underqualified to do this because we've got several luminaries from the past and present of EPW in the room, and as many of them as I've spoken to about the history, I've got a different version of it. So this is my version of what may have gone on for the last 20 years. So if I could start by actually a little bit of a confession. In the words of the Beatles, it was 20 years ago today, but it wasn't 20 years ago, actually. It was longer than that. So we've got you here under false pretenses, because Pastor Training International was formed in 2003 following conversations between businessman David Ide, who you will see pictured on there, and it's great that we've got his son with us here today, and Pastor Reverend Timothy Alford at Horsley Evangelical Church in Surrey. And that's I think we trace the beginnings of the organisation back to there. David and Timothy held a vision to resource pastors and Bible teachers of little means in the most deprived parts of the majority world, many of whom, as a lot of you will be aware, only receive elementary level education and certainly haven't had theological training. So Timothy had been a regular visitor to Africa and especially to Malawi. So it's great that we've got Josta with us this morning because we can trace some of the roots back to activities in Malawi, where he had been General Secretary of AIM, and so he'd seen the depth of that need. The same thing that Richard was witnessing to earlier following his visit. So that is where we can, I think, trace the origins of the organisation back to. But before I go into a sort of a history lesson, I want to give you a bit of a geography lesson, which is my background. So we're going to look at a few figures about the depth of that need, which they identified. And I think, in large part, it's still true today. So here are some statistics that are a little bit old in the tooth. Hopefully you can roughly read those. But these are figures that were produced back in around about 2010, because it looks at the growth of expected growth of Christians around the world of all denominations, sizes and shapes over the period 2010 to 2050. And what you'll see is the great news that the number of Christians is increasing, but that's partly to do with an increasing global population, because the percentage of Christians remains roughly the same at 31% of the world's population. As I say, that's of all sizes and shapes. But that's the big picture. You'll notice also the huge growth in the number of Muslims, but that's another story, I think, for another day. What I want us to focus on today is that growth in Christianity, and in particular, as I say, the geographical pattern of that. So again, statistics from that study back at the time show that whilst the overall share of the number of Christians in the world's population overall percentage is expected to stay roughly the same, the regional distribution of that is changing hugely. And perhaps most notably, the share of the world's Christians living in sub-Saharan Africa is expected to grow from about 24% in 2010 to 38% by 2050. So, and whilst incidentally it will be falling in Europe to just 16% by 2050. So there is a major shift, and in 2020, in a more recent report, there were more Christians living in Africa than any other region in the world, and they are expecting by 2050 there to be 1.28 billion Christians, a very hard number to imagine, in Africa, and there will be more, in the world, and of those, more people will be living in Africa than in the next two most prevalent regions, which are Asia and Latin America. So what was previously a very Europe-centric situation has changed dramatically, and that's the world into which this need was identified and to which we still speak. So again, looking at more recent reports, there was a report in Christianity Today in the middle of 2023, and at the risk of being a little bit boring, I just want to read the very opening of that article from that publication, which I just think captures it. It says, "I recently received a handwritten letter from a pastor in India. His name is Roy, but I don't know this gentleman, and we'd never corresponded. Somehow he contacted me and told me about the two congregations he leads in Andhra Pradesh and of his great desire to study the Bible. But the end of what he said struck me. I have no money. And Roy isn't alone. Countless pastoral leaders worldwide are eager to faithfully lead their churches, but they lack access to training and resources. And this is especially the case in the majority world contexts in Latin America, Africa, Asia, where the gospel continues, as we've seen, to grow rapidly, with hundreds of new congregations being birthed daily." So The World Evangelical Alliance represents churches in over 130 countries and estimates there are 50,000 new baptized believers every day. And all of those new Christians need shepherding and need pastoring. So the challenge really is highlighted when you look at one more statistic, which is that in the United States there is one trained pastor for about every 230 people in America. In the majority world, there is one trained pastor for about 450,000 people. So it's just a massive, massive need for well-trained pastors in the majority world. And that, with the growth of the church in the majority world, is only going to grow. So the need is huge, and on top of that, as I say, that's sort of all flavors of Christians, if you like, because although the churches are growing exponentially in many places, the gospel actually has very shallow roots. Pastors are undertaught, overworked, under-resourced, unable to give their congregations much more than the basics of the gospel. And as we've heard, some of them don't even have a Bible to expand what they do know. So they do require that solid doctrinal food, and they do require encouraging to help them grow in faith and be disciples. On top of that, there is sort of false teachings, pressures of theological error, worldliness, persecution, all of that sort of bundled in on top in these locations. And the prosperity gospel, well illustrated by some of the pictures there, is just rife, particularly across Africa, but other parts of the world as well. So there are a lot of things to combat, even within a nominally sort of Christian sector of the majority world. So enough of the geography lesson, but that, I think that inspires you to keep going and think there is something really important to be done here and that we should be doing. So if we go back to the origins of EPW, I've got a picture of some great luminaries, at least just one of whom is in this room, I think. So after the initial discussions, a group of volunteers with various skills were called together, including current trustee Chris Embleton-Smith, to establish a 3-year training program in expository preaching, which was backed up by the giving out of good books. Along the lines of, you'll remember the origins were inspired by some of the work that AIM have been doing. They had something called Pastors Book Sets, and Pastors Preachers Collection, I think, has sort of come out of that eventually. And there was a mentoring program that went with that. So local pastors from the UK, some of whom may be sitting in this room, were called upon to engage in the training in pairs. They went out for 1 week to two locations. That was the original model. I think some of the first training was in Malawi. I don't know if someone can confirm that, but that's what I'm told. So a ministry board was also set up, which involved such people as Timothy Alford, David Kingdon, Bill Summers, Peter Seacombe, and Gordon Oram, who unfortunately, he's only just retired from sort of active service with EPW, and it was just a bit too far for him to travel today, but he sends his regards and wishes us all well for today. So Gordon drew up the curriculum, and he advised on suitable books. So he has been a bit of a bedrock in quite a lot of what has gone on in PTI and CPW over the years. Then it was let's call it a cottage industry in terms of how those books were collected, distributed. Books were got from reformed publishers, and our relationship with publishers over the years is a big theme of this that we've developed, and we're really pleased to have Day One with us here today as one of our long-time supporters and partners in this ministry. And so please do go and have a look at their stand later and see if there's some books you're interested in there. But so the books were obtained from publishers, and I think the first warehouse, please do shout if I got this wrong, was in Milford, in the garages of David Ide's house. And then later there was some, it says garages on my notes, but I think they were a shed on Dunsfold Aerodrome. Is that pretty much right? And they were very cold, there were no loos, it was pretty basic. And yeah, that was where it started. Training and resourcing with books through PTI. And then as I say, presumably due to Timothy's background, I think a lot of the early work was in Malawi, and this is a picture on the beach, so it was a tough life of books being distributed to a group of pastors being trained in one of the very first courses being run in Malawi, I understand. So that's on the banks of Lake Malawi. So PTI, and here is a few random shots from over the years. There are many, many of these. Formal groups with their certificates after training and rooms full of people studying. PTI was undertaking the training, and Gordon, with his network of pastors around the world, sort of introduced an element of networking. Potentially, I've got a number of 4,000, I don't know if that's accurate or not, but he had a lot of people that he knew, and he was running that from the UK and started sending out books to those people. Sorry, I'm crackling. So that was where it came from. By the time we get to 2014, there are some other elements to talk about in a moment, but Simon Percy, who I'm delighted to see here today, joined as Director of Ministry, and if you like, that gave it some sort of real focus, because we had a full-time person against the role whose job it was, to develop the training curriculum and to look at other locations. So it became a 5-module training curriculum, and again, this model of local churches sending out their pastors to support the work was the way that it was going. And they would go and run these conferences, often supported by their churches. So, over the years, it became apparent, and I think it became particularly apparent during lockdown when people couldn't travel to these countries, that we needed to put some effort into resourcing people locally. And so that was really where that work was born. It was that PTI started to look at training locals to undertake the training on behalf of the organisation. By this time, the training course had established changed to 6 modules, which is what it still is today. And the idea was to train up local people to run these courses locally, so it wasn't always dependent on people travelling from the UK. Really important of that sort of approach, and we'll be hearing a lot more about this later as we talk about empowering local people, is the local cultural context and the examples that they can give and the way that idioms that are used in the talking, and the fact it can also be done in local language. So I think Dave's enjoyed going to some training courses where he sat there and probably not understood a word because it was in Chichewa or whatever at various points, and we were both in Nigeria, and you could see the passion going on when it switched out of English to something else, but you didn't necessarily know what was being said. But anyway, over the years, it's well over 100 training conferences have now been run in more than 19 countries. We do invent those statistics a bit, and I have to say it's on my list of things to do to actually nail this down and see if I can collect a list of all the training we've ever done, which I think will be quite a task because it is so much. And we've trained at least 3,000, it's probably getting on 4,000 pastors face-to-face in those training courses. So that's PTI as the origin of EPW, but in the middle of all of this, a new organisation was born. Christian Books Worldwide was established in 2009, and it sort of emerged from that PTI work. So it's quite interesting, we've sort of gone full circle bringing the two back together. But with the demand for conferences increasing, and the number of people on those training courses, it was just, the book side of things was just becoming too big and distracting, I think, from what was going on the training side. So PTI was going to focus on the training, CBW was born to look at the supply of books and also then the mentoring of pastors on an ongoing basis by sending books. And it was from this that I think the translation work really kicked off. I'm sure there had been some translation work before, but once it was within CBW, the need and the helpfulness of having books in local languages was brought even more into focus. So CBW started to develop its translation work, and the pioneer project for that was a book called Ultimate Questions, which some of you will know, by John Blanchard, and that was translated into Punjabi, and then Urdu, and then Amharic, and we still occasionally use those books, and we've still got those translations available to use. So CBW's founding trustees, who were Jim Goff, David Ide, Friedhelm Anhuth, Robin Asker, and Mike Taylor, who is here. Soon commissioned translations of further titles, so Mysterious Ways by David Kingdon, Foundations of the Christian Faith by Roger Weil, which I think is our most translated book and one that is always very well received as a sort of basic explanation of what being a Christian is about. I think that's been I don't know how many it is, but it's 20 or 30 different languages on that one. 17, that's what I said. 17 languages is a lot. I've got a database of all the books that we've got, and that's the one that has the biggest section on it. Walking with God, simplified version of J.C. Ryle's classic manual, Practical Religion, has also been a key book over the years and goes down particularly well. And given that, when it was written, it is still so fresh and relevant and really effective in the majority world. So the success of this was huge, and more requests for translations, more and more requests for additional books, and an increasing number of people asking us to supply books, all of which we've done for free for the recipients over the years. So there's now more than 200 titles have been translated, and about 41 languages, probably 42, because we did our first Yoruba one the other week since this was written. So, amazing work. And then on top of this, people started to say, well, I've got this library of books that I don't know what to do with, surplus books. So CBW started to receive books in English and in French. Initially, early on, they collected so many of these books that 27,000 in one go were shipped to South Africa for African pastors' conferences and for them to be used in African countries as they were going back with them. And more of those were added. So handling second-hand books and distributing those became an important part of it, and that still is part of what the charity does today. And we will send them to seminaries, but also to individuals who can benefit from perhaps those deeper, more complicated books. So a few more pictures to entertain you. So there's Sukesh, was one of our early translators working on books in Swahili. So there he is, sat somewhere in Kenya, translating the book on a laptop. There is one of the first books, if not the first book, translated into Swahili, which looks rather serious. Sin is Serious is the title of the book, and it looks pretty serious to me. And on the right-hand side, we've got Gordon with Timothy Mang. That's a very old picture, I think. And Timothy is in Myanmar and has done a lot of translation work for us out there. And clearly that's a particularly difficult country to be serving now. But even to this day, EPW is doing work of training and distributing books into Myanmar, which is great, given what's going on there. Again, by way of entertainment, here's some pictures of the early warehouses. So the left-hand one is the warehouse in Dunsfold, where Roy Proctor appears to be about to have a shootout with John Reed. So you can see they were not very sophisticated. Top right, Kirkford was clearly a rural location, overseen by an owl by all accounts. And down in the bottom right-hand corner is Cricklade. So those were the sort of three warehouses that were still there actually when I joined CBW. And but from that, the work has grown, and we've sort of, I suppose, professionalised it or consolidated things. It's been put onto a sort of a stronger and indeed more expensive footing. But we moved the centre of book distribution to Swindon, where Tay Storm, another long-standing supporter of CBW, helped us set up the warehouse in what was an old Spitfire factory, now being put to better use. We now rent 2 units. The operation is increased to such size that we now have 2 units full of books through which we're regularly processing, sending out of new and second-hand books. The new books includes something we call the Preacher's Collection, which you will find on a copy of, a set of, on the back of the table. And they're 15 books that if those were the only 15 books you ever got, that would be a pretty sound library to set you up as a pastor in the majority world. Now, they're aimed very much at sort of secondary school and above type levels of education. We're also developing something called the Preacher's Toolbox, Pastor's Toolbox, Preacher's Collection, Pastor's Toolbox. far too confusing, which is more at primary level, primary school educated, simpler, shorter books, and that's something that we're actively working on, what that looks like and how we use that. So CBW, distributing new second-hand books to pastors throughout the majority world, translating books. That was very much the focus there. And during this period, which was also the period where I joined, James Starman took over as director, and he was a prime mover behind getting us set up in Swindon in this much more sort of professional style. So it's great to have him with us here today as well. And again, in this history that's now jumping around somewhat, I don't think I can let today go past without mentioning my good friend, and indeed good friend to a lot of people in this room, Jerry Marshall. I think it was Julian who introduced his father, David Ide, to Jeremy in around about 2013. I've got two different versions of when that happened. And he agreed to take on the role of chairman of both CBW and PTI. And maybe that's where some of this coming together started. And so that's a picture of Jeremy on the left. On the right-hand side, he's with a bunch of friends and contacts from the Serbian Balkans Theological Seminary, where he had a particularly strong relationship. And over the years, as well as what you would most obviously call the majority world, CBW has done a fair amount of work in that Balkan, in Serbia, in that area, supporting them with books. So all of that came together, as I say, partly prompted by Jeremy getting everybody to talk, but also out of a growing sort of just coming together of strategies and direction. So PTI, you'll recall, was training local trainers. CBW had come up with an approach which was about setting up hubs, which was to set up hubs in different countries to help distribute books in a more cost-effective manner and to manage those activities and the individuals we were helping in those countries a bit better. And after a while, those two started to sort of merge in their thinking, and often the people involved in the training would also be involved in the book distribution. So it started to become quite natural that the two organisations maybe should come together. And that indeed did happen after much prayer and thought, because they're quite different organisations. PTI was very much a sort of deep work with a small number of people. CBW was more of a broad work with a lot of people, but there's a role to combine the two. And that's what we decided to do, and that eventually happened after probably a year of talking and planning in February 2023. So we're only just over a year old in that two organisations coming together, and perhaps it would be fair to say still finding our feet on that, and we'll talk about strategy and direction in a moment, because I think that's relevant to say, okay, we've brought all of this together. How do we best serve the people we want to serve in the majority world? How do we get the best out of both elements of this organisation? Let's not just do all the things that we've done before because we've done them or we happen to do them. What is God's calling on this? What is the direction and what's going to be most effective? So more of that in a moment. So what is EPW today? Well, it's a UK registered charity, and we do all the activities that you've heard about as part of PTI and CBW. We support untrained and or under-resourced pastors, Bible teachers and pastors in the majority world through in-country training, through new and second-hand books, and through provision of translated materials. And to give you, an idea of what, remember back in 2003-04, started as a cottage industry, a group of well-intentioned people going, we can pull this together and make an impact and do something, and not being frightened by the scale of the need, which, as I've described, is huge, and you could easily be frightened off. It would be a fantastic ambition, and with God's help, maybe EPW will do it, but it's unlikely. So, but I think you've got to start somewhere, and that's what the organisation did. And now it's grown into an organisation with an annual expenditure, if you want to measure it like that, of about 400,000. So it's not a small cottage industry, if you like, or a small cottage charity anymore. And this is slightly dated, so ignore the dots and exactly what those mean, because I think we've sort of moved on a bit from regional and national centres as described on there. But that just gives you an idea of the reach of the organisation. So the dark green is where training courses have been run in those countries, and the light green is places where we've distributed a noticeable number of
books. So a large part of the world, 190 conferences, 21 countries, 7,000 plus. There you go. You see, the stats have changed already. So this was our estimate. I think it's a lot more than was what I said earlier. Somewhere just short of 1 million books. And this slide is from 2 years ago now. So we will be, I bet we're topping 1 million books now if I actually go and work it out and add it up. 65 countries, 120 titles into 41 languages. So, big work. And as I say, where is it going? What have we been doing more recently? Empowering local leaders. This is Josta's operation in Malawi, which you'll be hearing more about, so I won't steal the thunder on that. I won't say anything more about that. But we've started to work, we do work with individuals in countries. So we've got particularly significant presences in Malawi, in Nigeria, in Uganda. Zambia has always been a long centre for training, and we're developing that region. We've also in India, based out of Chennai, we have a hub there. So those are probably the biggest sort of centres of our close relationships, but we've got a network of other people who we also work with in other countries. Train the Trainers is still going on. We're slightly reshaping the way that we're delivering that at the moment compared to what PTI's approach was, but that is still absolutely the ambition, identifying some trusted characters who can take forward that work so that we aren't always having to have the expense and time of sending out people from the UK to support that. As I say, that evolves. It's horses for courses, depends on the country and what's required. So that's what we're doing, empowering there. And I've almost finished. A couple of other things. The Pray, Prepare, Preach series of books, which you'll find copies of on one of the back tables as well, is a series of titles that we've been given full publishing, copyright, translation rights for, which is a really exciting development. We haven't really made as much as we will be doing of this yet, but increasingly those are the focus of our training activities, and because we have those rights, we can then start to look at translating them into the local languages for the places where we're doing a training focus. In addition, some of you may be interested if you want to have a look at the books, we can actually run that as a commercial operation. So we're doing it in a pretty light touch sort of way, but if you went on our website, you'll see that you can actually request to purchase some of these books, which would bring some valuable income in for EPW Pastors worldwide. And we think they make great books for a home group study or maybe even for churches to work through. So there's a lot of potential with these very practical guides and commentaries to the Bible and to how to do expository preaching on that. So they're a core part of our activities. So looking to the future, and as I say, I'm going to hand over to Stefan to give us his talk on how we've been approaching that. But very, very briefly, just a few things that I know are sort of happening, not quite irrespective of what Stefan says, but we're developing the PPP series we've talked about. Audio books, we've got some exciting developments going on there because a lot of the places that we work in have an audio tradition rather than more than just a read tradition. And we think there's huge mileage in getting audio books out there, and we're looking at effective ways of doing that at the moment. Translated books as well, so local language where local pastors and their congregations can get in a group and listen to God's word being preached. So we are also working closely with an organisation in South Africa to set up a regional hub where we can perhaps delegate some of the activities of organising, coordinating, training and book distribution in sub-Saharan Africa, because as you heard at the very start, that is without doubt the biggest area where we're needing a lot of sort of effort and resources. So and handing over to Stefan, we are reviewing how we use our resources most effectively.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. And my name is Stefan Cantori. I'm one of the trustees of EPW, and previously I was involved in the board of Pastors Training International. I just want to say a big thank you to Adrian for his service to the ministry. Sterling work with many challenges, and we're very grateful for your commitment and service to the Lord in what you're doing with EPW, and much appreciated, and thank you for your work. My first slide, yes, it's called EPW development. I think it should be EPW DV. It's about being dependent on God and God willing. And I think one of the things I've learned, many things I've learned through being involved in this ministry, is that you come along and you think, oh, I'm going to serve the Lord here. He really needs me. And actually, then you realize that he wants to teach me things through service, and particularly dependence on the Lord and dependence on prayer and coming before him, recognizing that what we're faced with is a need so huge. We couldn't possibly, as individuals, conceive of how we could accomplish anything, and yet God is at work. And as we pray, we see answers to prayer time and time again. And I think many of you here have been involved in praying for EPW. Thank you so much for that. I think that's at the heart of what we need, actually. What any of us need is to be dependent on the Lord. So it's fine me talking about strategy and plans, but it's the Lord's will and his work. And I just really want to emphasize that as I sort of open up some of the issues that we're looking at as we face the next 5 years plus. We'll see how we go. It's an emergent picture because the Lord seems to work in his own time, in his own way, not necessarily according to my own timetable or project plans. But we're grateful for the insights he gives us and is giving us. So I've been involved in sort of working to understand what we might be looking at for the future, and some of the activities I've been involved in and you've been supporting in different ways. Discussions with organisations and individuals. What you realise as soon as you get involved in this field is many, many organisations from many countries across the world have been involved in different aspects of this work. Some very similar to us in terms of their doctrinal position, others quite different, and yet with a heart for the Lord. And so having a sense of what others are doing, what their work has been, what lessons the Lord has taught them has been really helpful for me to do. We're reviewing what we're currently doing. It's more of a challenge than you might think, as Adrian's indicated, just keeping tabs on how many different things the Lord is doing and using EPW for. So having an understanding of that. And then there's been a survey of stakeholders. No review would be complete without getting everyone's perspective. And many of you, I think, have responded to a survey which we sent out. Thank you for the work you put into doing that. It was much appreciated. We had 151 responses, which was a bit overwhelming. You normally expect about 5 or 10. You know, when you send something out, you think, oh, how many are going to respond? But 151, 60 from Africa, 20 for Asia, 10 from the Americas, and 60 from the UK. And that's just a testament, isn't it, to EPW's reach and involvement. You're present here. Many of you have travelled some distance, but we're involved with people far and wide across the world. And we've also been getting feedback from pastors themselves who've been experiencing the training and interacting with EPW. And Dave will talk a bit more about that in his next session after lunch. So we asked them, what are EPW's strengths? Well, there's a focus on pastors, which is fantastic to hear. We've got the right focus here. A good doctrinal basis. People really appreciate the doctrinal basis upon which EPW is founded. And many of the testimonies from people are that they've had their lives transformed by a reformed understanding of the scriptures. And that's really made a difference to them and their preaching and to the gospel work that they're involved in. Good training and books. It's great to get that sort of feedback, isn't it? We appreciate that feedback. Care and empathy for people. Because at the heart of all of this are people, yes? This is not an abstract discussion about people over there, but these are people who go through their own trials and tribulations. And part of the work we're involved in is supporting the discipleship of pastors, helping them understand what the Lord is doing in their own lives and how he's using them. And so caring for people and having empathy for people in many different contexts is seen as a strength. And folks say it's an appropriate mission, that what we're doing is focused correctly. How we do it might be a bit different. How we describe it might be a bit different. Where we put an emphasis might be different, but the core of the mission is correct to support those who have been less well-resourced in their life experiences, in their education, to accurately preach the gospel with resources that enable them to do so is the mission of EPW and is, according to the feedback we received, the right mission. So what are our weaknesses? You always ask this question, don't you, with a bit of fear and trembling. Lack of resources compared to need. The need is huge. It's beyond what we can comprehend. And that's something that the board of EPW is being reminded of routinely, regularly. And it's good for us to be reminded of this. And we're also reminded of the Lord who is sufficient for all this need. So we're dependent on his resources. But resources are slim from our perspective. There's a lack of in-country region development. And Adrian alluded to that. But we see that as an area for further development and one which we need to focus on in the future. It's not about what we're doing in this country, but it's about what is needed and what can be best done in country, in region. Again, that links into the next point. We could strengthen the involvement of locals in the work of EPW. And by locals, I mean pastors, but also their churches and other organisations that are working in the region and locally and engaging with them in fresh ways that support a united approach to gospel work. One of our weaknesses is financial sustainability. Well, I mean, that's I guess, something for those of you who've been involved in ministry and mission work, that's the recurring theme of our lives, is that we're always seeking the Lord for more resources to help us. And he keeps us on our knees, doesn't he? Praying, seeking his resourcing. But financial sustainability always feels a bit of an issue for us, always a question. So where will that money come from? How will this work be resourced? And the need for more volunteers. We're grateful for all of our volunteers who function both in this country but overseas, but there's always a need for more. So what are the challenges facing the work over the next 5 years? Adrian alluded to some of these. The growth of false teachers and teaching is what we're being told through this survey from Africa and from Asia. Poverty amongst pastors and people. You know, people are poor. Those we're working with are very poor. There's a need for resources, their lives, food, medicine. So there's something for us to take a view on as well in terms of our support for them practically, not only in terms of teaching and training, but recognising their life circumstances. The availability of materials and training compared with need, it's a recurring theme here, isn't it? Resources to expand the work, that's one of the challenges. And then pressure for people to conform with secular thinking. So there's a spiritual battle, isn't there? We can talk about the logistic battle, the resourcing battle, but there's a spiritual battle at the heart of this. And there's the devil's work is to distract people with secular thinking, with ideas which aren't centered around Christ. So there's a challenge for the work in the future. So what should we be doing? This brings me to my last slide, because after I finish in a few moments, we'll be inviting you to spend some time in prayer. You've had so many sort of inputs, I think, in this last 45 minutes or so. It's time to bring them to the Lord, isn't it? But let me just finish with this slide. What role should EPW play? Well, we should expand international and local partnerships, including churches. So thinking about those who work internationally already in this area of training and of resourcing, of books, of materials, working with them, and then thinking about local partnerships, how we develop those in country, and support people developing partnerships that work. Partnership is a funny word, isn't it? It's warm and cuddly as a word, but actually when it comes to it, it requires a lot of work, a lot of effort, and a lot of sustaining, and a lot of trust to be built up to make it a sustainable partnership. So we need to be developing our skills in doing that and helping others develop similar skills to build those partnerships in the work, whether that be internationally or whether it be locally. Focusing on local pastors offering more bespoke support. again, Adrian alluded to this, but when we talk about the majority world, well, it's a bit of a funny phrase, isn't it? Because every place is different. People are different. Their language is different, their culture is different, their way of thinking about the gospel might be different. There's so many differences, and we need to think about what support is most appropriate in different contexts and listen to people as they tell us what support is needed. It's not about EPW saying, this is what we're going to do, but it's about listening and working in partnership with local people to establish what is the most appropriate support. And that's again, a fair amount of work to do, and a fair amount of humility to continue to develop amongst us, to listen and respond appropriately to different circumstances. Emphasises expository preaching. Expository preaching gets a great write-up, isn't that fantastic? And we need to continue with that focus and support that. Make more resources available in different formats. So that's something that sort of we're working on, the use of technology in different ways. The internet, availability of the internet across the world is changing and developing. The resources and skills needed for that are changing. So we need to be thinking about how we respond to providing material in different formats. Developing local leaders and hubs. Again, that goes back to the theme of what can we do locally that will build EPW work, rather than seeing it all being provided centrally, but how we develop those hubs and local leaders who can take forward the work. And ensure training is effective and integrated with resourcing. So we're still in the process of bringing CBW and PTI together. It's not a sudden overnight. We need to work through how the resourcing and the training all come together and how they become consistent and helpful for people. So we've got work to do on that, and that's part of what we're going to be doing over the next five or so years. So that just gives you a flavour. The board is due to consider its strategy in March. We'd value your prayers for that meeting as we seek the Lord for his guidance, that we understand from him what we need to prioritise. Often the cry from Adrian and the team is, well, what's the priority? And we say, oh, well, everything's the priority, you know. But we need to really think, what is the Lord guiding us to? How might we do this? What's the support we need in terms of prayer and other resources? So we've got a lot to consider. So the Board of Trustees, as I say, meeting mid-March, would really value your prayers as we consider these matters and seek to develop our plans under the Lord's guidance. So I'm going to suggest we spend a bit of time in prayer. I'm just conscious that there is so much we could be praying about here, isn't there? We could start now and go on until the end of the day. We've got about 5 or so minutes. I'm going to suggest we pray in small groups. Just turn to the people next to you or behind you, just in small groups. I shall leave this slide up, actually, just to give you a flavour of what you could be praying about for us as we consider the way forward. So just 5 minutes, and then I'll bring a time of prayer to a close. So bring these matters, please, brothers and sisters, to the Lord.